welcome. I just pushed the button, so.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to We Belong Here, our series at Advanced Native Political Leadership, where we talk with leaders throughout Indian country on topics and work building political power. That includes educating our public on positions that impact our lives. My name is Prairie Rose Seminole. I'm a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes and staff here at Advanced Native Political Leadership. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the tragedy in Minnesota with the killing of Daunte Wright and the accountability of the murder of George Floyd and the convictions of Derek Chauvin. We want to recognize that this is all deeply connected, our politics, our systems, and how we treat one another. And I know there are leaders out there leading with love, building within community to build and continue to create systems that work for all of us, our policing, our democracy. We're facing multiple crises like racial reckoning, our economy, the pandemic, and a rapidly changing climate. Indigenous, Black, and Brown leaders are on the front lines creating change in real time to address these issues. And what can be lost in movement spaces as we fight is how we're taking care of one another. And we've established such beautiful care communities within these frontline movements. And we have to ask our questions now around taking pause and how we take care of ourselves. April is Stress Awareness Month, and we wanted to take that moment to talk and pivot to protecting ourselves and grounding ourselves and thinking about systems change work and how we change and decolonize our own minds. Joining us today is Dr. Michael Yellowbird. Dr. Yellowbird is the Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. He has held faculty and administrative appointments at the University of British Columbia, University of Kansas, Arizona State University, Humboldt State University, and North Dakota State University. His research focuses on the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, ancestral health, intermittent fasting, indigenous mindfulness, neurodecolonization, mindful decolonization, and cultural significance of res dogs. Thank you for that. He's the founder and director and principal investigator of the Center for Mindful Decolonization and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. He serves as a consultant, trainer, and senior advisor to several Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, mindfulness groups, and organizations who are seeking to incorporate mindfulness practices, philosophies, and activities to indigenize and decolonize Western mindfulness approaches in order to address systemic racism and engage in structural change. You can find him online as an author. You can read his books. He has written many articles, book chapters, and research reports, and is the co-editor of 4 books: For Indigenous Eyes Only, the Decolonization Handbook; For Indigenous Minds Only, a Decolonization Handbook. Oh, I read that one twice. Oh no, there's two of those books. Indigenous Social Work Around the World Towards Culturally Relevant Education and Practice, and Decolonizing Social Work. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Yellowbird. Can you tell us more about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. Thank you, Prairie Rose. First of all, I just want to say it's an honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation to talk a little bit about some of the work that I do, and for this very special time in history where so many things are happening at very breakneck speed, and we hope they continue to happen in terms of justice. And just to let folks know that I am coming in from the land Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Manitoba, which is the homelands of the Anishinaabe people, the Cree, OJ Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people, and the traditional homelands of the Dene. So I'm a visitor here. I've really been treated well here, and it's so good to be here at this time. So that's where I am right now, and what I do, I guess, is actually quite unique, at least in Canada. There hasn't, I don't know if there's been very many deans at this level at an institution, like large institution like the University of Manitoba. So I've actually moved from being a social work scholar for many years, and also an Indigenous studies scholar. There's where a lot of my books and papers have been written. But I've moved into now upper level senior management at a university, which is important because as an Indigenous person, I can bring to a faculty a vision that can help to decolonize a curriculum. indigenize, the systems and the institution based upon a lot of what's going on around the world and in indigenous communities. So that's what I'm doing right now as a dean, but I'm also very engaged in developing different kinds of programs in our faculty. For example, we just started a big overhaul, and we've completed like a big phase 1 overhaul of our PhD program that focuses on indigenous people, decolonization, and international populations. And we're very excited about that, and we're getting a lot of interest, and people are applying for that, because one of the things that I'm determined to do, as at least part of the legacy I want to leave, is to develop the next generation of indigenous scholars that are going to be in the academy, writing, creating new theories, and then of course pushing ahead curriculum, for systemic change. So that's what I'm doing now. Previously, as a professor, I've done a lot of work in decolonization, conceptualizing decolonization, and interpreting decolonization for social work. I think probably, I've probably done that a lot more than most folks have done. And I didn't actually get that training in the United States. My first faculty position appointment was at the University of British Columbia. So I have to thank, Indigenous people in Canada and the scholarship in Canada, and the scholarship that was happening just right across the Pacific Ocean to the Pacific Rim in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, where a lot of Indigenous scholars were really working on conceptualizing and operationalizing decolonization. What does it mean to be affected by all these generations of oppression, colonization, land loss, land theft, boarding schools, residential schools, genocide, and the uncertainty of the future? And that's the piece of colonization then that sort of put into motion, I think, a lot of really very devastating disparities in health and in education and well-being. And so decolonization has been development of what are the solutions we can draw from that our ancestors knew, or that's happening in the world where we can have these conversations. So a lot of my work that I've written about has that kind of context to it. And of course, my latest book, actually, that I co-authored with a colleague in Finland, Dr. Chris Clark, I was able to implement into that book a number of stories that come from our people, from the 3 affiliated tribes, in conversations that I had with my father and some of my relatives who told me stories. And it's, I was really so happy to be able to bring that to a larger global audience, because I want them to know that we're still here, we still have our stories, we're surviving, and we're passing that knowledge down. And so when they read those stories, they'll see that there's this dynamic sort of intellectual as well as cultural revitalization that continues to happen, despite the fact of colonization, despite the fact that historical trauma has existed. So that's really kind of what my work is intended to do, is to continue to try to make scholars as well as nation states and governments aware of who we are. And so because of my work, I've been called upon many times to present my work internationally and globally, to different venues. I was invited to present some of my work to different parliaments around the world, and I had a chance to do that. But that's the thing we do, and I think that I can truly say that the 3 affiliated tribes, along with other people, but I'm going to talk about our people right now, have really had a strong intellectual tradition of thinking and of being able to balance our indigenous ways along with using from the Western menu those things that are also helpful to us. And that continues on with that kind of work. So that's just a bit about some of the work that I've been doing, and I'm still committed to that. I'm still working, and I'll continue to do that. I think that's my purpose in life, is to continue to translate for the rest of the world what the experience has been, like the colonial experience, and maybe there's a period of post-colonialism that's happened, not completely, but how we're surviving after the very devastating impact of colonialism on our people, right? We see that. And so part of my work today too is also about good health. And as Prairie Rose was talking about, I'm very interested in ancestral health. Years ago, I used to be the tribal health director, as well as the tribal health or human resources administrator for the 3 affiliated tribes. And I was very committed to trying to change the trajectory of the health that was being affected by adopting a Western style lifestyle, which has devastated the populations. You know, as we see around us, a lot of diabetes, a lot of chronic metabolic diseases like hypertension, obesity, those kinds of things that our ancestors did not deal with. So that's a big part of the colonization of the body and the colonization of the mind. So again, how do we decolonize that? And I think some of my work talks about that. Let me say this last thing too. One of the latest books that we did, co-authored a book with about Arikara ethnobotany, Asanish Arikara ethnobotany. And what we've done is we've dove into the literature that Melvin Gilmore was talking about in his contacts with our tribal people back in the early 1920s. And we take those and we sort of do the ethnographic work with all of the plants that our people used. And I got to tell you, I mean, these folks, like a lot of indigenous people, you know, had the very brilliant mind, and they were using an empirical method to understand how to use plants for food, for medicine, for healing, everyday use, in ceremony. And when we look at that, and one of my colleagues, who was the lead author on the book, Kelly Kincher from the University of Kansas. I knew Kelly when I used to be a professor at the University of Kansas. He is the hardcore white lab scientist who's taken things like wild tomatillos that actually grow still in Fort Berthold and all up and down the plains, that people treat it like they're weeds. But he's taken those and he's looked at those and other things in his lab and found out that some of the compounds that are in things like wild tomatillos, I think 11 or 12 different compounds, have very powerful anti-carcinogenic activities, which then will tell us a little bit why our ancestors didn't have the levels of cancer that we do today. Even though our ancestors carried epigenetic cancer from one generation to the next, that cancer didn't express because they were living a totally different lifestyle. So that's some of the work that I'm very interested in, along with mindfulness, and how this all comes together as a holistic approach to how we can, we can be better, and we can have better health. And we don't have to go far. We don't need government grants or feasibility studies. It's there embedded in our knowledge. We just have to listen, read the stories, and talk about it. So that's a bit of the work that I'm doing these days.
Thank you. Yeah, just looking at the image of the Earth Lodge, you think about how we were engineers, we were scientists, we were those who worked with the land, and the ability now that you have as a dean to allow students to immerse themselves and people in the world within our worldview. I think that just moves to that shift in narrative and that shift in mindset to think differently about moving people in a real way and centering our narrative. Like, this is who we are. Let's stand firm, and we can decolonize and think about the narrative that's out there about us, not just through affiliate tribes, but I think there's a narrative out there, that poverty, racism, sexism, obesity, and sickness even, people think of that as unfortunate, right? Like a car accident. And that narrative that comes out that people have to put themselves into these situations that are unfortunate rather than unjust. We can't drink our water because it's toxic, and we're not blaming the corporations. We're being put into an unfortunate diagram of we need to help those people versus let's hold the corporations accountable. So I think when we talk about narrative change and shifting mindsets, people can go further than a video or a book. They can actually immerse themselves into these structures and into these systems and challenge the power and transform those systems that have caused us harm by looking at who we are and our identities and our groundiness. Anyway, we've been in a week of 18 months of stress, and all of these justice moments informing our work. Can you talk about your thoughts on the justice moments that we're in, and how it's informing your work, if at all?
Yeah, so when I think about justice, it's important to kind of go back, I think, and put it in context, who we are as Indigenous people, especially three affiliated tribes. We know that back in the day that justice between tribal groups and within tribal groups had a very different tone to it before colonization. For instance, there's a very good story, I think, it was written about Buffalo Bird Woman, and part of the story talks about one of the young, I think he's a young Hidatsa man who was approached by an agent and asked to be a police officer. And he came back and he told his father, I'm not remembering all the characters or all the people right now, but he tells his father, he said, yeah, the white agent asked me to be a police officer. And his father said, well, what did you tell him? And, this guy was in his 20s. He said, I told him I'm too young. I can't do that. And his father said, that's good. Because at that point, they knew that the people they were putting in the villages to uphold justice and to do policing, community work, had to be people that had some maturity and ability to negotiate and understand the people, And that's the difference, I think, with Indigenous justice and Indigenous policing models back in the day, is that they didn't put young men in there, that had not been tried and tested. They put people in there that were skilled negotiators, skilled readers of body language and had this high level of emotional intelligence, so they could understand how people were feeling as they were in the village, right? And so we knew that there was a big difference there in terms of justice and how you uphold it, so that there's equity and equality in society. Second thing about that, so it's very, very different than Western justice right now in terms of the other thing you think about, where where you go to court and you have two sides and it's about dispute. It's not about healing. And when you look at Indigenous, when I was a professor at Arizona State University, I was so impressed with the work that the Navajo were doing around peacemaking. And then I started looking at the literature and found out, wow, this is what tribes did, amongst themselves and within them. So they sent, these emissaries of peace to each other when they were having war. They would take a pipe and they would have a conversation and say, let's make peace, And you had these constant kind of things going back and forth, negotiations about that, in terms of justice. And one of the things that a lot of people may or may not know, that there's a ceremony that's called, the Lakota call it the Hunka ceremony. It's the making of relatives. And that's a ceremony that came from the Arikara and to the Lakotas. A lot of people don't know that. They talk about making relations. But that happened, of course, a lot of listeners will know this, when the Arikaras were traveling and they had lost one of their sacred bundles. And the Lakota found it and took it, and they knew it was something special, so they kept it. A group of Arikara emissaries came and they sat down and they said, this is what this is. It's very important. We will pay you for that. So they gave them seeds and different kinds of things. And they created a ceremony right there to make relatives between them, because if you've ever read, I think it's, he's a Seneca orator, Red Jacket. He said, tribes may fight about all kinds of things, but we don't ever argue about religion. So it's very different than the Western concept, because for them, justice, was about the big picture, how we're related to the universe and to all, the elements around us, and how we fit this all, we're all related to all one another. Of course, it wasn't, there were hard times and there were wars and those kinds of things. So that was the starting point. Going back a bit, before we get to the here and now justice, I remember when I was a little kid, and my parents used to go to Newtown, and we got to Newtown, and I would see a lot of the Native men who had been arrested by the police at that time. They had them all in their oranges or greens or whatever they had on, and they were sweeping the streets of Newtown. They were painting, and they were using them as a form of slave labor. They would, when they caught them out on the street when they were intoxicated, right? This is part of the colonization. And there was really no justice there. There was no representation. You weren't innocent until proven guilty, and then that sort of thing. So I just remember that. And I remember my parents would be looking at to see if any of our relatives were picked up by the Newtown police, and they were put, into this kind of, work pool, or this slave labor pool, so they would be cleaning the streets. And so, we came from that era too. And then of course to the, American Indian Civil Rights Act and that sort of thing. So, and then the other, in the 60s, when I was a kid, the American Indian movement and the Black Panther movement on the coast were, of course, part of that justice movement. They were out on the streets trying to, in Minneapolis, that was happening in the Bay Area, other places, in Denver, Seattle, different places, Chicago. This was happening. We had American Indian movement and Black Panther movements going out trying to protect the people from the police. Yeah. And of course they were doing a lot of good things. They were starting schools. The Black Panthers started schools. They had breakfast feeding programs. You had the, I think, the Little Red Schoolhouse in Minneapolis that was feeding children, and educating them about their culture that had been lost because of colonization. So to me, those are really, really big justice movements that were happening. And of course, then as we sort of fast forward to Standing Rock and other places like that, that's when you can see people standing up for, it's not justice for human beings, but it's justice for the land, for the water, for the planet. And people were making their, their voices heard. And of course, if you watched any of those videos, and I have to say, I was very proud, because when I was a professor at the University of Kansas, some of my students were on the front line from Indigenous Studies. One of my students who was operating the drones was getting footage of what was happening and getting that information out to the rest of the world. And so, these are the things that, that we hope to kind of teach in Indigenous studies and at all the campuses, to get our students involved in justice movements. And this is what our people did. Not only were they on the ground, our students were on the ground, but students from all over, and were there. But we also, had using this technology like drones to kind of document what was happening. So when I think about justice now, that's really an interesting concept, because we are in a state where we continue to utilize the courts of the colonizers and the colonizing laws, and everything in a colonizing society is set into motion. And this is what we would call, classic settler colonialism, where settlers have come in, they've created an identity, they've created the standards of what behavior or morality is all about, and then they enforce them. And it doesn't matter if you come from a different culture or a different race or gender, whatever it is, you're subject to that kind of thing. So it's not really of the people, for the people, and by the people. It's of certain people, by certain people, and for certain people that the justice system is going to work best. And we see that, happening all the time. So it's I think that's really important to remember. And what's hopeful to me about this, that justice can change, and it is changing, is that we're getting more and more Indigenous people and BIPOC people into legislative governments, really around the world, that are beginning to change laws and policies to create more equity and equality in justice. So the other thing in the current movement now, we would never have had this conviction. I shouldn't say we, but this conviction of Chauvin would have never happened, I don't think, had it not been for a cell phone, right? A cell phone. Maybe you can see that. I guess you can't see it now. But a cell phone was that in itself. I think people have begun to use that, and they're using it even more skillfully. And it's pointing out to settler colonialism and to the white supremacy. Everything that you've been saying that you said doesn't exist, we show you that it exists. And that's, a picture, is worth 1,000 words. And so convictions are happening there, and realities are shifting and changing. And that's, of course, after the murder of George Floyd, when people viewed that awful murder in real time, it set people out into the streets. It didn't matter whether they were Black or white or Indigenous or whoever they were, people of color, other people of color, transgender, whoever it was, old, young, people got out in the streets, and they were, it started a very, very important movement towards, let's begin to, unveil the racism that exists, that really kind of was hyped up a lot by the Trump administration and all these neophytes that were part of that administration. And people went out and they demanded change. They didn't go and stand and protest, on the street quietly. They didn't wait for the government to pass a law. They went out into the streets and they used whatever was necessary to create change. The corporations, universities, the businesses began to respond by changing the names of Confederate generals on buildings, by dropping these people that were slave owners. Some of the sports teams began to drop, the Redskins names and all those kinds of things. Things that people have been working on for years and years, trying to go through the right process, and it would be rejected and rejected. It just took the people getting out in the streets, and in 2 weeks, 3 weeks time, those things were just changing overnight. So that's the power of organization and activism in a smart way. That brings about justice. So I think that's where we're in now, this moment. And we all saw those people lining up for the verdict on George Floyd, because seriously, there was going to be some hell to pay if this Chauvin would have gotten away with murder, because everyone knew, could see it was murder. So I think that's what's happening. And the fact that BIPOC people are coming together and they're being joined by smart, allies, white allies, that's a movement, and it's pushing for more justice. So.
Yeah, I was talking with a sister earlier who just said, I'm all over my Twitter feed, all over my social media feeds. I'm seeing people of color, Black, brown, Indigenous people stepping forward and says, there's still work to do. There's still work to do. So what we're missing is that we need white folks to step into that realm saying, yes, there's work to do. Let's deconstruct this. How do we do this? And it's also along that vein of shifting narrative. I mean, you're speaking to, the Indigenous experience, and Indigenous peoples, Black, brown peoples have a set of experiences that are not often acknowledged or recognized in the systems around us in sense of a justice sense of it. And so we're so used to these systems of bias and hate that justice looked like a guilty verdict, right? But in reality, that was just accountability. The justice would have been that we're all alive and thriving, that we're all, given this, this aspiration of we the people, have the right to all of these liberties. Yet here we are still fighting to have that sense of justice. And I think there's so many in the dominant thinking that perpetuate these systems that we're in, and those issues of, racial disparity and, the access to wealth or being able to build wealth. There's so much work to do to deconstruct those systems. And you speak to decolonization. And I think for many of us, we might need your definition. What does decolonization mean to you, and the colonial systems around us? What does that mean for us as Indigenous people and the greater society? What is decolonization and deconstruction of that colonial system around us?
Yeah, so good question. Thanks for the question. Well, decolonization, I think we have to think about, before we talk about colonization, we have to think about, what colonization is all about, what colonialism is all about. So most of us have never really been formally taught or given, an instruction, or learned in school, or learned even at the level of the university, really what colonization is. And in the United States in particular, in North America in particular, the reason is because the US, even all the way down to Barack Obama recently, when he was president, I think in 2009, he was talking to Al Arabiya TV. He was saying the US could broker a peace deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And he said, you can trust us. He said, we were never born of colonization, right? And of course, that inflamed a lot of Indigenous people. I said, well, here's Barack Obama. He's really the friend of the Native people, Harvard graduate. He knows absolutely nothing about colonization and about how colonization, has been a really major enterprise of the United States. Colonization then means like the invasion and subjugation of people, right? And that happened not just to Indians or Indigenous people, it happened to tribe after tribe, in territory after territory, all across the continent, north and south. in the Americas, right? In the Western Hemisphere on Turtle Island, went all the way down south, but we'll stick to the US. And I'm thinking like, wow, this is the guy who, who's been an activist and so on, doesn't recognize that colonization really means that it's like a foreign entity, like a virus, like COVID-19 that's out there floating around, and it enters into the body, through some way. And that's what colonization is about: forced entry or entry into a place, right? Just like COVID-19 would. And there's a period where that contact happens, and then it becomes toxic. In colonization, it becomes toxic, and people begin to suffer because of that. And then there's a period of death and destruction that happened, where genocides happened. So this follows classic colonialism: the exploitation of resources, the theft of land, the renaming of places like rivers and land, scapes and those kinds of things in the minds of colonizers as they're taking over. And then finally, the last thing is that they colonize the people. They get the people thinking like them, working for them. And I've been criticized about this before, but I've written about it quite a bit, about how colonial armies around the world have engaged indigenous people to fight their wars, right? They have, no matter what wars we talk about. And once the people do their duty, they go back and we did this, we fought for our land, we fought for this country. They come back and they still continue losing rights. They continue losing their lands, right? So that's the exploitation of the soldier, the exploitation of the finest, youngest people that we can have, that are used, for fodder for the military, so that the rich can get richer and imperialism can stay strong at that level. That's all part of colonization. So there's that period of invasion, the period of toxic relationships, and then when we begin to lose people and lose lands, and we see systems collapse, and finally the colonization period where they pull us in and we help maintain the enterprise, right? So that's colonization. So what does decolonization mean? Well, decolonization, in my mind, I've written about this, is that, so we've been colonized. What we need to do is we need to begin to purify ourselves and really begin to strategically look at the ideas, the values, the ethics, the ideas and theories of contracting and relationship, all these and beliefs that all come from colonialism that are incompatible with who we are as indigenous people. And there's a number of them, right? I mean, there's a number of them. About the belief system, for example. We may believe that the land, is a land that has sentience and it's alive, that we should not be mining it or damming up rivers or those kinds of things, right? We should be very careful about these kinds of things, because it has a consequence, which it does. We know that now. Then the values of people could be about money and about getting ahead. Whereas indigenous people, many of them, saw poverty and inequality as a major virtue to keep relationships, clear and healthy. So that's the first part, is to kind of scrub out all those different kinds of things that are incompatible. That's the purification part of decolonization. The next part of decolonization is a period of renaissance, where we begin to dig deep into the knowledge and the wisdom and the science of our ancestors who did all these things, whether it was negotiating between one another, whether it was governance, whether it was economic development, whether it was trade relations with other tribes, whether it was religious, spiritual orientations and the way that we applied that in our everyday lives, as opposed to only on Sundays. And we begin to draw up all those things that work for us, and that's the Renaissance period. That's the period we're in right now. We're scrubbing right now, and we're in a period of Renaissance where I see a lot of young people that are doing that. They're rethinking governance. They're rethinking food sovereignty and food security. They're in universities doing research to this kind of thing. They're rethinking social relationships. They're restoring language. They're restoring their history, and they're doing all these really important things. So that's the period of Renaissance, to pull those ideas back out that work. Finally, the last period of decolonization is the period of enlightenment. And we're moving towards that period of enlightenment, where we can see that, as our ancestors said, all things are related. All things have some kind of strong interactions, some electrical magnetic interactions, like what they call unified field theory, right? What are the strengths of interactions between things that keep things going and strong together? So we're looking at what kinds of things out there that are happening in the world and how we're connecting to those things. And something as simple as what we're doing right now with this technology is the period of enlightenment is where we birth new ideas, new technologies, new relationships. And what we need to bring to tribal people is, a scholarship and getting people to talk about, they say seven generations ahead, but that's really now in line what in the academy they call futuristic studies. What can we imagine in our brilliant minds and visualize in our brilliant minds what 150 years will look like from now, based upon trends in the past and based upon the technology that continues to happen. So that's the last piece of decolonization. So you have that period of purification, scrubbing yourself clean, the renaissance of ideas, and the enlightenment period where you're drawing from new ideas that are happening every day and finding out how it fits into your culture, right? And how it can enhance your culture and how you can live, as in a hybrid way to bring in more than one idea, to bring them together to kind of strengthen, you as a people, right? For all the generations. So,
yeah. I feel like we're seeing a lot of that even within our the modalities of movement happening around creating communities of care to respond to the violence and incidents of violence from law enforcement and white supremacy happening across the country in the United States, where we're seeing Black, Brown, and Asian folks coming together in solidarity and creating what we need to protect ourselves, whether that's food distribution, whether that's, medical aid, education centers, especially in the last 14, 15 months of the pandemic, where we had to adjust because we saw that the systems around us weren't accommodating our needs, especially the healthcare system not accommodating at all or ready for a pandemic. And that renaissance of coming together, we're seeing so much solidarity amongst our peoples, and where I feel like the leadership is showing up to do that the best they can from places of love, especially because we had government administrations and other corporate administrations who were not meeting the needs of the people. I'm looking forward to that age of enlightenment. I hope that happens in my lifetime as well, where we are in this emergence of and from the pandemic to transform systems and to either reconstruct what we were coming from, knowing that wasn't working, knowing those relationships were toxic, knowing that system was killing our people because of our expectations around what it is to work in the United States. I'm glad you're in Canada, where I think they believe in vacation and holidays, right? So much of the world has picked up on that need for rest and resetting. And I believe that we have elected leaders across the country who are doing their best to lead from a place of love for community and to be on the better side of history. I mean, we're seeing movement help create those spaces, and we need all of those layers. But I also imagine there are so many layers coming to and coming at those elected leaders where they could be pushed and swayed off track. What advice do you have? What tactics would you recommend for those in leadership to be centered in a place to do this work without defaulting to that dominant culture value systems of colonization that has led a lasting impression on us? But what do you recommend for those who want to be grounded in their values and move us towards this vision where we might not know exactly what it is, but we know it's away from that toxic system of colonization?
Yeah, good. Again, another good question. So some of the work that I do, the major part of the work that I do now is in neuroscience and also decolonization. So I've created this conceptual framework called Neurodecolonization, and it's really about decolonizing the mind. And what I use in real time actually is Western science to look at brain images to see what the brain is doing when someone is focusing on something positive, what's happening, or focusing on optimism, or focusing on positivity in all these different kinds of ways. So we know now that the brain, all our brains are what they call plastic. There's a brain plasticity, meaning that the brain can change its structure and its function when you give it new tasks and new novel, or give it novel sorts of information and learning, right? Just like learning a new language, learning how to do, advanced mathematics, or learning to play an instrument, or learning to sing, or doing different things. The brain has this, huge capacity to serve us, and it's one of the most powerful allies that we have. And so I've really dove in deep into the neuroscience to look at, what the brain does under all these different kinds of conditions. And then I've circled back to look at Indigenous ceremony. What happens when people are engaged in Indigenous ceremony? Interestingly enough, Prairie Rose, is that when we are engaged in different kinds of really deep ceremony, we're focusing on the positive attributes of culture, and we're doing that, just like mindfulness meditation, we're doing that 20 minutes twice a day, and we're focusing on optimism, or focusing on decolonization, or visualizing what, empowerment. It begins to change the structure and function of our brain. And when I've looked at a lot of old pictures, and some of the pictures I've used some Edward Curtis pictures where I've seen Arikaras engaged in ceremony. So I thought, wow, what's going on with this man here who's sitting in an earth lodge looking at these sacred pipes? Well, I can tell you now what's happening to his brain at baseline, when the brain activity is going on, and the blood flow and the electrical flow that's going on. And then when he gets into a state of meditation, then you see dynamic changes happening in the brain, where on the left prefrontal cortex of the brain, just above your left eye, that's what they call the left prefrontal cortex. When that activates, when someone is looking at something sacred, and also, saying something sacred, but looking at that as a source of empowerment, that activates in that part of the brain hope, optimism, sense of well-being, joy, right? This is why Indigenous people, what they did with ceremony, and now we can understand why their ceremonies were so powerful. Other things, that were happening to the brain is in the back part of the brain, when this particular man in this Edward Curtis picture was looking at these sacred pipes in the earth lodge. I knew that he was looking at them, and it was feeding through his eyes to the back of his brain, called the occipital lobe, which is the seeing part of the brain. Well, he's seeing the sacredness. He's feeling it in the front part of the brain, or he's sensing it. The part of the brain then that's picking up, about the shapes of the pipes, where they came from, the ceremonies and the songs that were sung to bring these pipes, into use, where the stems were gathered from, where the pipestone is taken from, all the songs and all the ancestors that, handed these pipes down through the tribal way. You could see, the back of his brain, the occipital lobe light up, and he could see that, just like we can all see the past and the future. We evolved to have that creative mind. And when we do that with our mind, not only does it activate those areas, but it also activates through meditation, something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a big word, it's a neuroscience word, but it's BDNF. And what that does, when it's activated, when you're in deep meditation and practicing for a long time, or you're running, it activates BDNF. Or if you're sitting in a sweat lodge, and you're really praying hard, your BDNF goes up in your brain. And BDNF is related to what they call neurogenesis. That means the growth of new brain cells. So you can imagine our people all the time are growing a lot of brain cells, which would protect them from dementia and cognitive. It would improve their cognitive function, protect them from Alzheimer's disease, and from and the brain would get stronger. Also, it preserved the neurons they had. So when you get the cognitive reserve with extra neurons, you have this capacity to draw from those neurons to problem solve, to think creatively, to be creative in the way that you approach a problem. What stresses us out, the chronic stress and colonization, then, I would say that's going to affect any leader who wants to be a leader. So it's no surprise to me that Indigenous people, that they had to deal with rapidly changing climates. They had to deal with starvation, with droughts, sometimes war with other tribes. They had to deal with uncertainty. they developed a strong sense of cognitive resilience in their brains by doing indigenous ceremonies, like going for long periods of time without food, fasting. It's very, very natural thing people did. And calorie restriction, sometimes we didn't have enough food during the winter. We had to kind of cut back the meals. That in itself stressed out the cells in the body, but the cells come back and they get stronger and stronger, makes them more resilient. So I've had a chance to talk to young scholars, leaders, at a number of different programs have asked me to talk to incoming scholars in very different programs and prestigious organizations. And this is what I talk about. I said, you have before you right now the capacity to grow and to increase, your most powerful ally, and that's your mind and your brain, by doing these very simple kinds of things that, people have been doing for a long time. The science, the evidence base is very good in that and shows that these simple things like mindfulness, meditation, or ceremonies, is going to serve us in that way. And that's one of the things I would say to anyone who wants to be a leader. You have to decolonize the mind first. You may have the greatest ideas, but if someone disagrees with you and you get upset, or you doubt yourself, or you get depressed, your idea is not going to go anywhere. You build cognitive resilience, you stay positive, and when someone tells you something that's negative, you just build off that idea, you thank them for the idea, and you move on. So that's some of the advice I can give people, and that's some of the work that I'm doing with neurodecolonization.
I appreciate that. I'm taking away quite a bit from that, surround yourself with the sacred, right? So that we're reminded every day and that we can focus on those pieces. I was thinking in my head, he's like, hey, he's just trying to get me to exercise. He's trying to get me to go for a run or something.
That too.
Which I should do. I have a lot of animals that would love for me to do that more. We got to wrap up here pretty soon. And I really appreciate your time sharing with us all of these pieces. And I wanted to ask you too, before we wrap up, this is kind of a cheesy question, and I don't always go cheesy, but what around that advice, but I'm curious, who are your heroes? Who are those that have inspired you to take this path to decolonization and into wellness and into these steps? What are their stories? And I know we have only a few minutes, but who are your heroes, Dr. Yellowbird?
It's really strange, that hero question, because I could say a lot of people, like my mother was one of my heroes, my father, and of course, a lot of the people that were elders and relatives who, had me sun dancing and learning those kinds of things. And some of my brothers and relatives, close relatives that taught me a lot of cultural things. But interestingly enough, some of the people that sculpted me the most were the people that I disliked the most, that treated me the most bad when I was growing up, telling me that I'd never make it, or I wasn't cut to do this or that kind of thing. They planted in me, I think, they couldn't plant the self-doubt, first of all. I mean, they did once in a while, but for me, it was always to come back to prove that, oh, yes, I can, right? And so without those people that sang, like the others would say, yes, you can do it, you're whatever. But I needed the other part of the yin and the yang, right? I needed the other shadow side to say, you can't do it. You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. And I needed that part in order to bring to myself to a level of homeostasis and balance, to always make sure that I know that they're on my shoulder here to try to distract me. Where on the other side, are the ancestors, the relatives, family members, the most humble way, children, little kids, elders, people that I've only met maybe once or twice, or people that I've seen speak that I've never met, have all kind of been that combination, of having this multifaceted sort of effect on me. So, and all these other sides, which is, like I said, the shadow side, which is those people who are really nasty and mean and racist and treated you very badly, also prompted me to push me towards forward. And I think I was fortunate enough to have that kind of resilience to not to overindulge either one, to people to believe that, like, I'm the greatest there ever was, or I'm the worst there ever was. I think that's part of my manifestation, about who I am. I'm embodied with that idea of constantly, seeking and constantly analyzing and thinking about those kinds of things, understanding that, life has all these iterations and it's a continuum. And I'm on this journey, like with a lot of other people, and I'm loving the journey. I appreciate the journey. And I love meeting people on the journey and just to listen, to hear what people have to say, to talk with folks. And if they ask me to say a few words, I always love to do that. So I think that's what I'd say in terms of the heroes part. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got to close, and I know the times we're in are often challenging, and so I appreciate you making space for us and holding this space with us to speak to the wisdom that has come before you and the wisdom that you've been granted through your own gifts. But do you have any final comments that you want to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier that this is Mental Health Month. I think it's very important for us to kind of always do an accounting on how we're feeling. I know that the pandemic we have yet to kind of do a full accounting of the pandemic. I know my mother passed away on February 25th, at age 94. I didn't get to go to her funeral. I didn't get to see her. I got to play my saxophone. My sister Jessie put me on FaceTime with my mom when she was in the hospital, so I got to play my saxophone for her. My dad Willard was a tenor saxophone player, so I sort of picked up that jazz from him. He was very good. I'm just kind of a rookie at it, but I was really glad to do that. But she passed, and so did some other close relatives when Whiteshell passed away. And of course, it's still like we're suspended, I think, in that place. So you have to look at yourself to recognize that, it's important to kind of pay attention to that. Because I know when I get back and I finally get back to Whiteshell, I had a chance to visit my mother's grave, and I'm sure I'll cry my eyes out and be thankful to her though and have gratitude for that. But it's that kind of thing. I think we have to be clear about our mental health, because it's it's what we have, and in order to be honest and strong about it, we have to be honest and strong with ourselves about how we're feeling, checking in with one another, supporting one another, and also I know it may be hard, but if you practice every day meditation, mindfulness meditation, you sit and you breathe and focus on a positive word, positive prayer, a positive thought, you're going to find out that you're going to reap tremendous benefits from doing that. And you don't have to do it long, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, twice a day. And of course, it all begins with sort of launching that. So again, tell people, please take care of yourselves, take care of one another, love one another. We're at a very important point in time in history. After the 1918 Spanish flu, although it was horrible and millions of people died around the world, tens of millions of people died around the world. After that, many wonderful things happened. And I think that's what we have to remember. We've been shut in, we've been separate from one another, and we've missed one another. And there are good things that can happen, because together we can come together to remake this world. So use this as a springboard opportunity as we come out of this pandemic. Use it for what it's worth, and also use this guilty verdict of George Floyd. Use that to continue to see that justice is possible. Justice, or let's call it accountability, is possible. Right, as you said earlier, accountability is possible. We'll continue to work for justice. So thank you.
Thank you. I can't think of a better way to close. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Yellowbird.
Thank you.